At the beginning of the story, we see that radiation has spread across the entire world, causing mass destruction. Almost all humans have perished, and electricity has completely disappeared. Amid this apocalyptic world, we come across a lone survivor, a girl named Anne. She lives in a remote village surrounded by mountains and forests, one of the few places untouched by radiation. To survive, she wears a special protective suit while gathering supplies from a nearby abandoned store. Once she returns home, she removes the suit, knowing that her isolated region is still safe. She then thoroughly cleans herself, taking a bath to wash away any potential radiation exposure before resting for the night. The next morning, Anne resumes her daily routine of tending to her small farm. She lives with her dog, her only companion, battling loneliness while trying to survive. She assumes that she is the last human alive, occasionally venturing into the deserted city for essential supplies. One day, while walking with her dog near the forest, the dog starts barking at something. Anne hides and watches closely. To her shock, she spots another survivor, a man named John, wearing a protective radiation suit. He appears to be searching for a safe place, hoping to find an area unaffected by radiation. John, believing the air and water here are radiation-free, removes his suit and takes a deep breath of fresh air, feeling relieved. Anne secretly follows him and watches as he bathes in a lake. However, realizing the danger, she immediately warns him, shouting for him to get out of the water because it is contaminated with radiation. Startled, John panics upon seeing her. Anne quickly reassures him that she means no harm and insists he must leave the water immediately. By the time he steps out, it is too late. He has already been exposed to radiation. Soon, he begins feeling sick, vomiting as he struggles to walk back to his tent. Inside his tent, John desperately tries to inject himself with a radiation treatment serum, but is too weak to do so. With no other option, he asks Anne for help. She hesitates for a moment, but then administers the injection. Still unwell, John is unable to take care of himself. Anne, deciding to help, brings him to her home. Before letting him inside, she thoroughly cleans him and takes a bath herself to prevent any contamination. Over the next few days, she takes care of him, providing medicine and ensuring his well-being. Anne even prays, hoping John recovers soon, because deep down, she knows she does not want to be alone anymore. After spending so much time alone, Anne no longer wanted to be by herself. A few days later, John starts recovering. Grateful for Anne's care, he thanks her sincerely. He then shares his story. He was an engineer who worked in a government bunker. That was how he survived the catastrophic disaster. However, after a while, his food supplies ran out, forcing him to leave the bunker and travel on foot until he reached this place. John tells Anne that the reason this area is still radiation-free is because it is surrounded by mountains and dense forests, acting as a natural shield. Anne, who is deeply religious, believes that God has created this place as a sanctuary for them. She then shows John an old photograph of her family and tells him how she used to live here with her parents and younger brother. They all survived the initial radiation disaster. Her parents had gone out in search of other survivors but never returned. After waiting for many days, her younger brother also left to find them, but he too never came back. The next day, Anne is working in her fields, tending to the vegetables she grows. Seeing her struggle, John decides to help. He assists her in refueling an old tractor using diesel from local abandoned gas stations, getting it running again for the first time in years. That night, as they eat together, John expresses how happy he is to have found this place. He had always believed that there must be a safe area somewhere in the world, untouched by radiation. Anne also feels a sense of joy. She no longer has to work and survive alone. Secretly, she begins to like John and enjoys his presence. The following day, Anne goes to a nearby pond to catch fish. After bringing them home, John cooks them for their meal. During dinner, Anne tells him, "Winter is coming soon. We need to stock up on food because the fields will dry out and survival will become much harder. Now that we are two people, we need to gather even more supplies." Anne hopes to restore electricity in the house before winter arrives. If they can get power running, they can use the freezer to store fish from the local pond, ensuring they have enough food to last through the harsh season. But will they be able to generate electricity in time? With electricity, they wouldn't have to live in darkness anymore. John learns from Anne that she has an old generator, but it hasn't worked in a long time. Determined to fix it, he spends hours trying to get it running, but nothing works. Then, an idea strikes John. He suggests, "We can generate electricity using water from the waterfall. If we build a hydroelectric wheel, we can produce enough power for the house." However, they need a large wooden wheel for this plan to work. Nearby, John spots an old church made of wood. He asks Anne if they can dismantle it to build the wheel. But Anne, being deeply religious, refuses. She explains, "This church is important to me. My father used to work here." John, who believes more in science than religion, is frustrated but respects Anne's decision. Though he doesn't want to disappoint her, he still believes his plan could work. Upset, he goes to a nearby store, buys alcohol, and starts drinking alone. When Anne finds him drunk, she takes him home. However, under the influence of alcohol, John behaves inappropriately, which deeply upsets Anne. The next morning, John realizes his mistake and sincerely apologizes to Anne. Despite the incident, they both have grown close over the days and have started to develop feelings for each other. One night, as Anne tries to get closer to John, he gently stops her and says, "We should take our time to understand each other first. We shouldn't rush into anything." Anne respects his words and agrees. One day, while walking near the house, Anne comes across a weak and exhausted man named Caleb. He looks severely dehydrated and begs her for water. Anne, overjoyed to see another survivor, takes him home. However, John is not happy about Caleb's arrival. Fearing radiation exposure, John immediately checks Caleb's radiation levels. His suspicions are confirmed. Caleb has been slightly exposed to radiation. John insists he can't stay inside the house. He needs rest, but it's safer if he stays in a tent outside. But Anne, feeling compassion for Caleb, argues, "We can't leave him out there in this condition. We have to bring him inside." After some hesitation, John agrees to let Caleb stay indoors. But will Caleb's presence bring safety or new dangers to their home? Caleb is allowed to stay inside the house, and later that evening he shares a meal with Anne and John. During dinner, Caleb curiously asks John, "How did you survive the radiation and how did you end up here?" John explains, "When the radiation spread, I was in a government bunker where I used to work. But soon, our food supply ran out, and I was forced to leave. One day, while traveling in my van, I came across a sick little boy suffering from radiation poisoning. He was in unbearable pain and begged me to end his suffering, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, so I left him behind and moved on. That's when I eventually found Anne." Hearing this, Caleb shares his own story. "When the radiation started spreading, I was working in a mine with my crew. We were trapped inside for days. Eventually, some of the men insisted on leaving, which led to violent conflicts among us. They turned against each other, fighting for survival, and in the end, I was the only one left alive." Later that night, John takes Anne aside and confesses something he had been hesitant to share. He tells her, "Anne, I've been afraid to say this, but I think the boy I saw, the one who begged me to end his suffering, might have been your brother. He had left home to search for your parents, and I fear he never made it back." Anne is devastated upon hearing this. Overwhelmed with grief, she remembers her brother and silently mourns his loss. The next day, John and Caleb go hunting in the forest and successfully catch an ostrich. That evening, the three of them sit together, enjoying their meal. John later discusses the water wheel electricity project with Caleb, explaining how it could generate power for the house. However, he also tells Caleb that Anne refuses to let them dismantle the church to build it. Caleb finds the idea fascinating and decides to talk to Anne himself. After some persuasion, Anne finally agrees to let them take the wood from the church. With Anne's approval, the three of them begin working on the project. They dedicate days and nights to dismantling the church and building the hydroelectric system. As they spend more time together, Anne starts feeling attracted to Caleb. He is young and good-looking, and he too seems to be drawn to her. Their playful conversations and laughter increase, and they begin enjoying each other's company. John, however, notices this growing closeness and doesn't like it. One night, he calls Anne aside and says, "If you want to be with Caleb, you can. I won't stand in your way." Hearing this, Anne remains silent, says nothing, and walks away. Anne walks away in silence, unable to decide between John and Caleb, as she has feelings for both. After this, the tension between John and Caleb grows, and they barely talk. John becomes jealous of Caleb and can't stand seeing Anne with him. Meanwhile, the water wheel is finally completed, bringing excitement to the group. To celebrate, the three of them throw a small party at home. Afterward, they head to a nearby lake, enjoying a fun and carefree time swimming together. Later that night, as they return home, John confesses his feelings to Anne, saying, "I like you." However, Anne remains silent because deep down, she has started falling for Caleb instead. Heartbroken, John drowns his sorrow in alcohol and drinks himself to sleep. That night, Anne goes to Caleb, and the two grow even closer. The next morning, when John wakes up, he notices a shift. Anne and Caleb now act like a couple. Realizing what must have happened the night before, John feels deeply hurt. However, he remains silent, keeping his emotions buried inside. Later that day, John and Caleb work together to install the water wheel. As they secure it in place, they both feel a sense of accomplishment. While wearing a protective suit, Caleb climbs a rope near the waterfall to adjust the final piece. However, he slips and nearly falls. John, who is already at the top, grabs the rope and pulls him up. But then, Caleb's foot slips again. This time, as they lock eyes in silence, John does nothing. Consumed by jealousy and resentment, he lets go of the rope. Caleb plunges down the waterfall to his death. John returns home alone. Later that night, Anne approaches him and apologizes for being with Caleb, saying she never wanted to hurt him. John replies coldly, "You don't need to apologize." Anne then asks about Caleb's whereabouts. John lies, saying he left to search for other survivors. Though Anne initially believes him, something deep inside tells her otherwise. Desperate for answers, she goes out searching for Caleb, but he is nowhere to be found. Eventually, the truth begins to settle in. John let Caleb die out of jealousy. When Anne returns home, she finds that John has successfully restored electricity using the water wheel. The house lights up for the first time, bringing a faint smile to her face. But inside, she is completely shattered. In grief, she sits at the piano and begins to play, remembering Caleb. Her music is filled with sorrow as she glances at John, who kneels in the corner of the room. John, a man who never believed in God, prays for the first time in his life, asking for forgiveness. And with that, the story ends. Do you think John deserved forgiveness? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss upcoming videos. See you in the next one.